All right, hello students. Drawing two students specifically. How are you? Hope you're doing well. Hope you have a good weekend. Had a good weekend. Hope the assignments are going well for you. And hope you're ready to review now. Going into today, we're going to look at the final project for our figure unit, which we've built up to. You've done different parts of the human body in small portions, and then if you haven't guessed it, you should guess that we now are going to do the full figure. There will be an assignment posted on Canvas in conjunction with this, and we're going to look at slides today, and the slides are going to also be available on Canvas just like usual. Yeah, you're welcome. Honestly, this video is just going to be like some extra tips. There's a few things we haven't really covered before. A lot of it's reiterating stuff we already know or have discussed. But I figure it's worth taking a few minutes for the couple concepts that we haven't discussed in depth, and also obviously you hearing me go over the requirements for the assignment. Even though the slides will be available to you, it'll be good for you to hear me go over it for my little nuanced extras in there, which I'm sure there'll be plenty of. So let's look at the slides. So that's not the first slide we should look at anyway. Keynote, let's see. Boom. Okay, figure final, creating value and expression while drawing, specifically the full figure. Yeah, we're going to talk about things we've already discussed: proportions, contrapposto, and foreshortening, but we'll dig into them a little deeper / just remind ourselves about them. We've already talked about expression and impressionism and all that kind of stuff with previous units and things like that. So yeah, pretty chill. So first of all, just like we did in discussing the face and the full bust, I want to go over the idea of proportion, right? Proportion is something that had to be sort of invented when recreating the human figure on paper. It was especially important for when they were sort of inventing ancient characters in history that were, or mythological figures, things that people they didn't have around, they didn't have photos of, obviously, in the ancient world and stuff like that. So they created these proportions so that when they created renderings of those people, they could obey that. But this, it helps transpose the human body, like when you're looking at it in life. Obviously you can just copy it and the proportions will be all right, but in order to help you copy it, systems of proportion were kind of helpful to nail down. So they're incredibly subjective. Mainly they're subjective in that, depending on when, in terms of literally observing something, the proportions are subjective because the angle you're viewing them can change the proportions. They're also subjective because every person is different. But then beyond that, there's also, when it comes to expression and meaning and sort of the point of when you're making changing the proportions of a human can change the station. Now, this is just like when we talked about facial proportions. I'm going to teach you about some of this idea, but at the end of the day, our drawings, what we're going to be drawing for this assignment, is going to be based on observing it in life right in front of you. Okay, so looking at art history, proportion standards are based on geographical region and era. This is largely, we can point this out based on two things. One, in the ancient world, it is actually the Egyptians who come up with proportion ideas first. They develop kins, is what they call it, and all this stuff. And it's kind of metric. It breaks down tens. But in reality, their proportions were not super accurate to life. That was just the system of proportions they used. The Greeks and Romans became much more intense about their accurate proportions, the 7.5 heads, 8.5 heads tall type stuff, which we'll talk about in a minute. But then in addition to this, you also have, during the Renaissance, that the Italian artists were often drawing in their best to get as accurate as possible, building form, having studied anatomy and musculature and bone structure and all those things. They tried to make proportion very accurate to life, whereas in the North, getting the surface intention, the intensity and the texture of fabric and skin and wood and all those different kinds of things, getting that accurate was more important than getting proportions accurate. So the way they drew people was different. And then in the late Renaissance, it all changes because of a movement called Mannerism, where everybody gets stretched out and kind of elongated. So yeah, depends on what the era is, depends on the societal standard, because when we talk about eras, Roman era, which was super about naturalism and accuracy, that's the same place where the Renaissance, even mannerism, they, in any case, change this, what's expected of artists, but in addition to this, are artists expected to be stylized? Are they expected to create their own way of drawing people, or are they expected to draw accurately? This changes things, right? That's what we talked about. Or, if it was scientific, if it was anatomical, which was important for some Greek artists, which was important for some Renaissance, of course, other artists later in the north of Europe, it may come back to where they got stuff. All those things are those more. The more scientific approaches are more based on observing exactly the proportion of the model you are looking at. So once again, we're going to go over proportions, but our use, that's why I kind of highlight here, our aim is going to be the more scientific purpose of getting proportions to be accurate to our observation. Okay. There's all kinds of resources, links here. The slideshows, as always, when you open the slideshow on Canvas, it's going to have links within it. Hopefully some of these links still work. They're pretty old now. But yeah, just a good example. These are one Botticelli up top. He was really referred back to old Greek and Rome, Venus on the half shell, or we if you look in on the Aphrodite or the Venus idols, those are clearly referred to here, and they were an attempt to be, although it was still sort of stuff. Nowhere near Cornelis on in the incredibly dramatic. They're definitely extreme. I mean, 6 for a second, then his arms all, and then and he's almost the size of the full torso of the Madonna, all proportion. But again, that's just giving you and tons of anatomical resources, which studies like especially inches in a that Leon did, which actually getting into him talking about the Renaissance and all that. I'm going to take a quick drink of water. Thanks for that. Okay, so Leonardo da Vinci is one who really, like Botticelli, but to a greater degree, and Michelangelo did this as well. They looked back at the old Greek and Roman proportions as like scientific and mathematical matters, where it wasn't just about understanding this like consistent proportion, although that part of it, it was also just understanding all the parts of the body, individual musculature, individual bone structure. With the Vitruvian Man is a drawing done by Leonardo based on the idea that Vitruvius came up with. He was a Roman architect in the 1st century BCE. He related the perfect male form to the perfect geometry of the square and the circle. And when he discussed this, Leonardo turned it into a drawing, which we see right here. I am sorry, my wife is mowing the lawn as I make this video. So yeah, sorry if you hear that. In any case, yeah, Leonardo drew this one right here, the Vitruvian Man. And then, of course, Michelangelo is another good example of a Renaissance master kind of taking those proportions much more seriously, much more scientifically than the artists that we saw on the last slide. But again, this is all kind of changes based on the standards of the time. I know you can hear the mower now. Based on the standards of the time, based on the needs of society, and based on what their point was, stylization or observation. Just to go over some of these standard sets of proportions come up with in history, just to give you some examples of kind of different ways that the proportion was changed, develop different stylization. Anyway, basically the normal standard, this was developed in ancient Greek and Roman society and then really highlighted in the Renaissance, was 7.5 heads tall. If you take a human head, this is only if they're standing perfectly looking at you. If you take the human body and then take the head measurement, the full body will be 7.5 heads tall once you include the feet and all that stuff. It's also 2 heads wide. Yeah, and that's kind of the standard. And then if you extend that, that's the academic proportions. If you extend it to 8 heads tall, so you take, the same size head, but add an extra half head to the full length, it sort of elongates the body. And so in that case, this is the idealistic sense of proportion. They actually also open up the width a little bit to make it not look totally out of whack. So it's 2 1/3 heads wide. But that's not as much as adding the full head to the width. So yeah, it still has a little bit elongated, sort of again idealized look to it, but not nearly as elongated as fashion, which is sort of this 8.5 heads tall. So again, an extra half head to the length, and then still this one stays 2 1/3, maybe 2.5 heads wide. So you get a very stretched out, very elongated sense of proportion. And we use this for fashion a lot of times. That's why they always, hire models and things that are like super skinny and tall, and whether male or female, they do this because it's almost mannequin-like, and it's something that it's more about the clothes and the display of fashion and statement than it is about the proportions of the human at that point. But then the last one that I like to talk about is the heroic proportion, which is that full 9 heads tall. So much, much taller. Basically, the head is really small at this point, and the body is real bulky and large because it's almost 3 heads wide, 2 2/3 wide, right? So these proportions changing, they're subtle, but the changing of the proportions changes the way you look at them. And then artists didn't always go with these proportions. You could also go off of that. Like a good example, actually, looking at David's, this is Michelangelo's David right here, zoomed in on the hand, and you can see the hand is actually much larger, right? So it's actually, you would probably say, and actually going back one slide, to the Michelangelo's David, the head, it's actually more like 7 heads tall. So the head is larger in this case, and the body is smaller, which makes him appear more capable, makes him appear smarter, right? Or it's sort of the idea. The hands are very much larger than they should be, which adds capability and all stuff. And yeah, so that's proportion. And I will say, we talk about proportion, we learn all this, and these are general rules. I did say the 7.5 heads tall. That's that academic proportion, kind of like the academic proportions of the face we talked about in the past. But you should think about the fact that all this, once again, just like always, goes out the window once you're looking at a real person who's not standing perfectly straight looking right at you. Okay, but in addition to this, one thing I want to talk about when it comes to humans and creating that proportion, and why it's important to understand that not every pose is the exact same, is getting into things like contrapposto and foreshortening. So first off, contrapposto, we've talked about this before. It's just the natural idea of that old Greek idea of a stance where, when most figures are standing, just looking forward, they put their weight on one leg, and then they can tilt their head, they can tilt their shoulders, tilt their hips, and all this stuff, and create these sort of S curves and movements in their spine and their shoulder and hip structure. And it just sort of creates a natural spiral or S or twist or something. And depending on, sometimes it can be very extreme where someone's like bent over or sitting, these kind of leans and extremes are good to know about. But yeah, the standard right off the bat one you can say that's going to change some of these proportions, contrapposto, a good vocabulary word to know. Yeah, saying that weight moves more in depth with this because you're going to spend more time looking at the figure when you draw. You should know how just a little lean of the weight onto one leg, it changes everything, right? The proportion of the entire left side and right side and the relationship, and twist of the shoulders totally changes the position of the arms in relation to other. Just one side constricting, the other one opening. Shoulders and hips move toward each other or away from each other because of this this shift. That's just something you should know. Basically, that is not a small idea. It's very important, and it goes throughout the whole body. It's not just about shifting weight on one leg. All right, so we've already talked about, and foreshortening I'll get to in a minute, but that's another thing that can affect all these proportions. And it's a reminder, we've talked about it plenty of times before, but drawing from life, sighting techniques, remember, I've talked about this before, there's no real reason to super go over, but it's the whole idea of proportions is based on this idea of comparisons, which happens from sighting techniques, comparing height to width, height to depth, width to width. The common measurement as I've already mentioned in this slide and we talked about before, is the head. It doesn't have to. It can be the hand. It can be the foot. It can be whatever. We talked about that. Any done gesture with me. I've definitely talked about that. Yeah, you can measure any bony landmark. You know, the bottom of the sternum to the belly button, or yeah, fleshy landmarks vary based on the individual body shape and pose. So the belly button could move and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, the little landmarks on the body like that can be used for comparison as well, side to side, top to bottom, all that kind of stuff. But always remember, proportions will vary per person. And this is getting into, yeah, other ways of using the head. You can, you know, the arm, if it's 3 heads long, make sure when you draw it, it's 3 times as long as the head that you drew. Same for the legs, if they're 4 heads long. And it's not just about that, the little like bubble person thing you may have learned in the past where there's like 1 bubble for the head and then 7 bubbles tall. Yeah, there is a sort of standard to that height idea, but it can also extend to the limbs and the arms. Yeah, this is again, it's once more going over the idea of the 7.5 heads tall kind of proportion idea, and how, if you haven't really been able to follow what I'm talking about when I say 7 heads tall or 8 heads tall, it's basically this idea that, yeah, if you heads 7.5, then it would be the same size as your overall body. But again, you can use that for two heads wide, 3 heads for the arms, whatever, right? And all of this is often based off of landmarks on the body. Again, nipples, navel, pelvic bone, knees, head and shoulders, knees and toes, and all that stuff. Anyway, good stuff to know. But once more, remember that every time a person changes their pose and they're not looking straight at you, this all changes. So you can kind of use sighting to get the overall height. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to block in and draw what you're looking at. I know I'm kind of bouncing around a lot on this because I'm bouncing back and forth between things we've talked about and things that might be kind of new. And things that you've heard in past and things that, yeah, might be well known to you. But yeah, break complex poses down into simple angles. When that happens, where the pose starts to change the proportions, remember, you know, you can still do heads tall on a pose like this in the left, but just note that it's not going to be 7. It shouldn't be 7 because he's not standing up. It might only be 6, you know, because his thighs are turned sideways and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, just start. I say a lot of time proportions that you don't start by drawing the head and then drawing 7 spaces. Actually, that's very important. I hope you hear me say that. Don't draw the head and then draw 7 little spaces down. Think of it more like, this is why we draw with gesture. You're going to bounce around and create the overall block in of shapes and pose first, and then you can use sighting to say, okay, did my full length of the figure, did it end up being the right number of heads long, or right number of arms, or right number of heads for the arm, or right number of feet for the arm, whatever, what have you, all that. But start by just blocking things in. You can basically start with a gesture when you draw a full figure pose, and then apply based on sighting. Again, not based on everything. Remember the 7.5 heads thing, much like the face proportions. Now that you know it and it's in your head, kind of forget it. But keep it around there just in case. Also, same goes for width. You know, if they turn sideways, they're not too head wide anymore and all stuff. Basically, the reiteration, a lot of what I'm talking about is a reiteration of jumping around and developing the full envelope of full pose and then filling in with everything later. And you can even, when you're doing it, again, I don't actually think you have to draw this big ball every figure. But yeah, like in this case, looking at this after you the envelope, saying, okay, the head right here, it's 4 heads tall. So you know, if I draw the head, you know, 3 inches tall, then I have to do the whole thing 12 inches tall, right? You don't have to bust out a ruler or anything like that. You can just use your thumb or a pencil or something. But just note, you know, in this case, this pose is 4 heads tall. Yeah, we've talked about all this before. Compare angles, compare size, compare sighting. All this is based on the idea of proportion. And really, I guess I feel like I'm fumbling a little bit in the description of these slides, but basically, this is an ancient idea. These are not new ideas to compare things, to use the head, to use the foot. And there is a science to it. And while the science changes the minute the body changes pose and moves, or is pointed towards you, or sits, or what have you, it's still grounded in the idea of the basic human anatomy. We've talked about sighting. Sighting doesn't just have to be about how many heads tall it is. It can be to each other, the face and the hand being in line, the knee front face, the foot being out in front of everything, the hips being furthest to the other side in this scenario. Oh, here, a good one. A back of the head is in line with the back of the arm, which is in line with the middle of the thigh, right? Vertical in line, like things being in line, vertically or horizontal. It goes beyond just simple measurements. And then once more, you've seen this slide before in my class, surely by now, foreshortening. If a body part or whole body is pointed towards you, it changes everything to compress. What's closest to you is going to be a bit exaggeratedly large, and what's going away from you is going to be a bit small. And so you have to observe based on exactly what you're seeing. Use positive and negative space. Use sighting. Use a foot if the head is blocked. Use a hand if the feet are blocked. Whatever. Remember, little details go off of what you've already done for a final. I like to add in little bits of extra fun stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the concept of tenebrism. Tenebrism builds off of an idea related to value. You should know the element of value. If we haven't talked about it before in this class, you should remember that value is light and dark. The Renaissance artists kind of created the concept with the word chiaroscuro. That means light and dark. That's what value is. It's the lighting of something. That on white paper, you imply the light, and then the shading that you put down, that's the dark, right? And that whole system of light and dark creates the idea of value. So tenebrism is a concept where there is profoundly pronounced chiaroscuro, profoundly pronounced value. There are violent contrasts of light and dark. What's lit is really brightly lit often, and then what's dark is very dark and sort of overcome. There's a lot of times this is spot lit, so there's a splash of light, and then everything else is sort of fading into darkness. Darkness is a dominating feature. It basically means dark, gloomy, mysterious, and it creates a sense of drama. And it really helps when drawing figure to have lots and lots of shadows, right, and violent light. We talked about this before for sure in the figure unit as well, that you just have this sort of it's helpful when you have dramatic differences between the brights and the darks. Okay. So yeah, tenebrism is this idea, overarching darkness, where especially in the background, it just basically you start by like tinting the whole thing if you want to, or certainly tint most of the background around the figure and then fill the figure in. This is also a really great way. Tenebrism is an excellent way to avoid outline. If you're one of those people who in my grading, I've been telling you, you've got too much outline, fade it into the background, fade it into the shape. Tenebrism is a great way to do that because there's so much dark. You can turn your pencil or your charcoal sideways and just turn that line, blend that line into the shadow of whatever is creating, because either the background or the foreground, and wherever your outline is, one of them is dark. So let it fade into that. So in this case, if there was an outline here on the top of this figure, fade it into the background. If the outline was here on the head, well, I'm trying to think of where a good one in for the back. Oh, the hand, right? Let's say that there's an outline here on this hand. Let's say that the hand, though, well, what they should do is if the hand is darker in this case, they could just blend this line into the hand and turn this shadow, or turn the whole line into this shadow. And yeah, you would lose the separation between the hand and the background, but the background would stay lighter, so you'd still see that it's the hand, right? You just lose that line that's separating it. But yeah, overall, just lots and lots of dark. That's sort of the concept of tenebrism. These are all a little more gestural than I want you to go for. I want you to spend a little more time with it than a lot of these drawings have. The one on the right's probably pretty close to, actually both of these are good. These are a little quicker. These ones are much more developed. And so this is really what I want you to think about. I keep trying to background lighter than the skin. Well, yeah, like bold line on the bottom of this figure on the right, the foot that is on the couch. This was just a big flat line right here, and then the foot started and it was just empty white, looked like it formed. So they've turned that line into the full shadow of the foot, and the background in this case is actually lighter, the background being the couch. But yeah, note all three of these overarchingly dark, full of tenebrism, full of drama, and note none of these figures are just standing at perfect attention looking you in the face. So all of these examples would have to be done, created using sighting. But once again, you can ground that in still using the head, still using the foot, however you want to do it. Use negative space, a great way for this middle figure. the space between the feet down here, that little triangle, the little angle between the thigh and the back of the calf or ankle. Uh, I guess it's the we're looking at, it's the one on the right leg, it's her left leg. But yeah, just looking at negative spaces and spaces around figures. That's what I want you to really spend time doing, and then filling them with lots and lots of dark. So let's take a look at what your actual assignment is. Now I'm finally getting to the nitty gritty specifics. I'm sorry, I keep choking on something. It's because I ate almonds before I started this. You will draw one figure in a dynamic pose with some sort of prop or setting. That proper setting I know always gets confusing. Basically, I need it to be on the ground. I need there to be a cast shadow. It can be on a stool. It can be this person on the pedestal. That's a fine. It doesn't have to be a very complicated prop or example. Just something that is them holding or pushing down or pulling something or standing on something, putting their weight on something so that it is grounded. It's not just a floating person in space. They can be leaning on something and they can be holding something, whatever. You're going to draw this on 18 paper, charcoal or graphite, however you want to do this, or charcoal. Either way, I want you to avoid a lot of outline. I'll get to this in a minute. I was going to talk about the lighting on the shoulders, but basically I was going to say you must use foreshortening on some part of the body. There are two caveat things that kind of make this a little bit more complicated than just drawing any old figure. First off, the foreshortening. I want you, like in looking at this pose here on the right, you can see that the knee is pointed towards us, the knee of the right leg. That kind of foreshortening is what I want you to at least have, right? It can be more dramatic. The arm can be pointed at us. They could be, I guess, leaning towards. I want the face and the limbs to be at least partially shown. No more hiding the face than profile view. That's about as minimal as you can do. I'd really prefer 3/4 view, or I guess straight on, although straight on is kind of boring. As the drawer, I mean, it can still be very exciting if you draw it well, as far as I'm concerned, my viewing it. But yeah, looking at this person, yeah, they're kind of slightly turned to their left or right. But yeah, the limbs are mostly shown. I don't want to only see the torso and all the limbs go off the page. I want to see most of the limbs. If you have one where things go off of the page, just send me the picture and I will I'll tell you if it's going to work or not. You can use clothed or nude figures. It's whichever you want to do. Although I will say, if it's just great big baggy clothes, that's not a very good study of the human figure. It should probably be more minimal than that. Which actually that gets me into, you need to draw from life. I didn't include this, but I hope it's implied at this point that you are looking at either a person in front of you, or more likely you're going to use a photo. You can use lineofaction.com. I think it's line-of-action.com. I put the link in past slideshows before, or in online. You can use line of action. You can use any figure model poses that you find on other websites. You can use a figure drawing book, but it better be a picture of a person. It cannot be a drawing of a person. Please do not copy a drawing. Certainly, as always, do not draw from your head. You're going to need to draw from life. Okay. You are going to, beyond creating the person, beyond creating, making sure you use a pose that has some foreshortening and that there's a prop that gives them weight and stance or pose, you're also going to consider lighting and create a sense of drama or tenebrism. You're going to get that overarchingly dark vibe. I am giving you this as a requirement because it's also permission to really cover the page in charcoal or pencil. Now, of course, I guess you can use white or you can use black paper if you want and chalk, but I want you, if you, most of you will probably use white paper, and so you're going to use charcoal and chalk, and I want that, or charcoal or pencil. You're going to cover that page in value, just like I've been harping on you guys in the grading of your individual facial features or feet or hands, busts, any of that. You're going to fill it in. There is going to be almost no blank paper left. Okay. Now I was saying on this pose here on the right, because of the really dramatic lighting, the shoulder is blank white paper because it's got that big hit of bright highlight, but everything else very much filled in. Lots of range of values. That means there's dark darks, then there's good mid-tones, then there's good bright tones. Then there's a few, very few little pops of white paper, but only in the absolute brightest spots where your skin would almost be shiny. Looking at me right now, you know, like the side of my face, this should be the only part that's actually white paper if you were drawing my face right now. Yeah, I've harped on that enough, but it's going to be very, very full value. No lines around things, and that's it. You know, I want you to draw it filled in. Okay. Here's my tips. Oh yeah, due dates are on Canvas. Check the assignment on Canvas to see the exact due date. I think I'm going to give you a week to a week and a half for this. Yeah, figure final tips. Don't be afraid to draw several practice gestures any day that you're working. The gestures can be, I'd probably start for your warm-up gestures doing all different kinds of poses, using maybe line of action or whatever, looking at a picture always when you draw a gesture. But then if you want to draw several gestures of the pose that you're drawing each day, that's fine. You know, the more you draw it, the better you're going to get at it. Consider positive and negative space, positive as much, sorry, consider negative space as much as the positive space. We talked about this before with hands, you know, and all kinds of other drawings of human figures, that the space between things is just as important as the things themselves. Consider value, no blank paper except in the brightest spots. So that actually reminds me, in the requirement of lighting and tenebrism and all stuff, making sure that your pose is lit really well from the beginning, before you start ever putting pencil or charcoal to paper. Make sure that the lighting is good and dramatic. You can't invent the tenebrism. You're going to have to find a pose that has tenebrism. Let me reiterate that. You don't invent the lighting. Get the lighting in the pose. So you're going to need to be picky. Hopefully everybody listens to this slideshow all the way to this point, because that's important. Okay. Yeah, because the only bright spots are in the absolute brightest areas. Okay. Sometimes less is more. Let me put a little caveat on this. This is really good information for like when you're drawing a full figure. Trying to get every fingernail perfectly is a lot of times an exercise in frustration. Trying to get every toe and toenail perfectly, every hair, every part of the cheek to be perfect. Sometimes implying the roundness of the cheek, or just implying the mouth, implying the bottom lip, implying the gaps in the fingers or the tips of the fingers. That's a good way to go about it. Now, I don't want it to be so extreme that it just goes back to being a gesture. But I think you kind of, you'll know when it's right, if it's just too unfinished versus sometimes just putting, you know, if you position a hand right, it's just sometimes a few shadows, and that's it. You don't have to put the wrinkles of the knuckles if you have the shadow of the knuckles, that kind of thing. New siding. What is under the skin? Oh, this is hopefully at this point too. But don't be afraid to like look at an anatomy book. Think about the bone structure underneath. Think about the muscle structure. I know when we drew busts, I was real serious about understanding that the neck goes down and the traps come out and all that sort of stuff, the position of the ears and all those sort of things. It goes for the body too, understanding exactly how the tricep eliminates into the elbow, and then how, you know, there's a muscle in the middle of my forearm that changes depending on how my hand is posed. All that, how that's connected. If you, and the more you study that, the more it's going to help your ability to draw the human body. That's just the way that is. Understanding the abdomen and the sternum and the rib cage, and then yeah, all that good stuff. It's going to really be helpful. So study all that, and this is perfect timing for my wife to come back around with the mower now. Yeah, because I'm just about done talking here. How long has this been? 33 minutes, man. Easy. Hopefully you all stayed in on this video and got the tips and help that you need to draw a full figure. Again, check the due dates on Canvas, because this is a final. There will be some sort of critique and reflection, so look for that. And otherwise, just you know, enjoy finding the or the picture. You can of course get your friends to pose and take a picture of that, you know, with good dramatic lighting. Use a spotlight, you know, whatever. Just create that tenebrism, find the pose, and draw exactly what you see, storing all those proportions you learned today in the back of your head, but draw the proportions that you see in any given pose. Yeah, That's a good summation of everything. Probably should have just done that and sent that in. Cool. Have a good one. Talk to you soon.